The wide-angle lens is a fan favorite when it comes to landscape photography, and for good reason. And when the skies are on fire and the light is perfect, most landscape photographers like to turn on their wide angle to capture the grand landscape. If you're new here, I'm Austin James Jackson, professional landscape photographer based in southern Utah. And in this video, I'm going to give you guys 5 of my favorite wide-angle tips that I think are probably unconventional, and hopefully they'll be thought-provoking for you to improve your images in the field. Now, when we talk about wide-angle lenses, generally I'm referring to the ultra-wide, which I would really define myself as anything that's wider than 20 millimeters. But the tips that are going to be in this video translate well into those mid-focal distances. So in this video, I'm going to show you a variety of images that I've shot to help demonstrate these tips, most of which have been captured somewhere between 14 and 18 millimeters. Let's jump right into the first tip, which happens to be one of my favorites, and it's something that many photographers don't realize or think about when they're shooting. Now, this tip is to use distortion to your advantage. Now, what you might not realize is that wide-angle lenses have a fair amount of distortion since they're so wide. Anything in the center of your image is going to appear a lot more rounded and fatter looking, if you will, while things on the edges of the frame are going to appear stretched. If you don't believe me, you can test this in the real world or even in your house with any straight line. It's for this reason that architecture photographers will use tilt-shift lenses because they compensate for distortion and allow you to get straight lines. But when you're photographing man-made buildings, it's obviously crucial to have straight lines because the eye knows that the building should look straight. But in landscape photography, since we're photographing natural scenes with curves, having no lens distortion isn't really important. And in fact, we can actually use this to our advantage. When you put your subject in the center of the frame, it generally gives it an unimpressive and unflattering look. Now instead, when your subject is an object that you want to appear tall and steep, like a mountain, a rock arch, or even a coastal scene, you will want to put this subject closer to the edge of your frame for a much more flattering look. Now, to demonstrate this concept, I took both of these images at the same focal length of 14 millimeters, same day, same everything. I didn't move my tripod, I only slightly adjusted how the camera was aimed in both images. The first image has the subject in the center. Second image has the subject at the top of the frame. Now, when I crop both images to cover the same area and then I overlay them, you can see the massive difference in what this interesting rock formation looks like. Absolutely nothing was done to enhance this in post-processing. This is simply just a trick that you use in the field. It's something that I use all the time when I'm photographing subjects that I want to look more impressive. The second tip is to avoid forcing a foreground when there isn't anything interesting. As landscape photographers, we do love to capture those wide-angle scenes where we can have great light, perfect subject, and then something interesting in the foreground as well. When all the stars align, and that works out, this is great, but more often than not, we'll try and force the in-your-face foreground that is ever popular when it just isn't quite interesting. Oftentimes, an overly busy and uninteresting foreground can actually make the image worse by taking attention away from the subject. We'll take this image for example, where I really thought it'd be a good idea to get right in front of this log to see the details. They looked cool in person, and I realized later on this was not a good choice. It's not interesting, and it actually makes the log ladder dominate the scene far too much, taking away from the main subject, which is the waterfall. Now, instead, a much better composition, which luckily I captured as well, would have been to back up a bit and have nothing in the intermediate foreground, but now there's a lot less distraction in the image, so I think this image looks a lot better. If you've got interesting leading lines or a foreground object, it's well worth trying out, but don't force something in the foreground when it's just not interesting or it's something that's overly distracting to work with. Tip number 3 is that you can't force the wide-angle shot. When I first started photography, I was obsessed with capturing the wide-angle scene, so much so that my wide-angle lens hardly ever left my camera. Now it's really the complete opposite. Don't get me wrong, the wide-angle scene is one of my favorite scenes to capture, but I've learned to be patient and not force wide-angle shots when the conditions just don't work out. Just because of the nature of a wide-angle lens, it's going to be much more difficult to get the right conditions to capture portfolio quality images. To get compelling wide-angle shots, you truly do need those really amazing conditions that don't happen very often. Beautiful golden skies, dappled light across the scene do happen very seldom, but these are the conditions that really lead me to look for my wide-angle scenes with my wide-angle lens. When these conditions aren't present and you're stuck with clear skies or maybe overcast days, look to your telephoto lens or another type of lens to capture portfolio quality images. With something like a telephoto lens, it's easier to isolate a very small part of your scene since you're able to zoom in and cut through a lot of the clutter that you experience when using a wide angle. So if you really are serious about wanting to capture portfolio-worthy images, you really just have to take whatever the weather conditions give you, which unfortunately may not be the wide-angle lens as much as we might like. Now, tip number 4 is that you really have to have an incredible attention to detail and especially pay close attention to the edges of your frame. It's easy to get lost in the subject and forget about the supporting elements, but remember that what you exclude from the scene is just as important as what you include. The best photographers understand everything in your scene should add to it, and anything that's not adding to that image is actively taking away from the scene by distracting from the main elements. The edges of the scene are really easy to forget about when you're focusing on everything else, but avoiding any distracting elements on the edges of the scene is always going to yield the best images. I like to pay special attention to ensure there's never any high contrast object or anything important or distracting or anything like that on the edges of my images, or else I'm going to spot heal in post processing to do so if I can't fix it in the field. Most appealing images are those that are easy to digest, and by keeping the edges clean, it helps keep your viewer's eye focused on the center of the frame. Now we'll look at this image here, which was shot on a wide-angle drone. I was at the highest altitude I could legally fly at, and I still had all these distracting objects on the edges of my frame. In my opinion, they take away from the subject and the simplicity of the scene. Since I wasn't able to recompose without the rocks on the edges, without uncentering my subject, I had no choice but to spot heal in post-processing. But doing so was very important to maintain this simplicity and tell the story of this lone-looking island in the image. In an ideal world, I can get this right in the field, but in situations like this, I might have no choice but to do so in post-processing. Luckily, this is generally not too difficult. Now, the 5th and final tip is regarding the filters you use on your wide-angle lens. It's important to purchase filters that not only have high-quality optics, obviously, but also filters that are really thin. Most landscape photographers like to carry and occasionally use polarizing filters, ND filters, even UV filters. What you need to consider on a wide-angle lens is that the distortion that can get added when you use these filters, especially if you stack them. Now, I like to leave a UV filter on my lens at all times, but I know that if I need to stack a polarizer on top and I want to shoot at 16 millimeters, I'm going to start to experience some vignetting around the edge of my frame because the front of the filter is now blocking part of the light from hitting the sensor. Usually this is something you can't fix in post, so if you get thicker filters or you plan to stack filters, you'll need to understand that you will need to zoom in just a little bit to avoid that vignetting on the edge. This video isn't sponsored at all, but I will link a few of my favorite thin ND and circular polarizing and UV filters down below in the comments if you are someone who's looking for those thinner filters. That basically covers 5 of my favorite tips that hopefully you haven't heard all of them before. Wide-angle lens really is one of the most fun lenses to use when you're out shooting, but it does take just a little bit of finesse to make it all happen and produce portfolio quality images. Many of the tips covered in today's video are some of the most common mistakes I see, so hopefully this helps you to avoid them in the future. Hey, if you've got questions, comments, or tips of your own, I'd love to hear from you down below in those comments. Otherwise, do me a huge favor, and if this video was helpful for you, leave me a like and subscribe. It helps me to continue to grow the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. Look forward to seeing you guys next time.